There is no political or social force stronger than national or group identity. The idea of liberal individualism might sometimes be more dominant, but its antithesis, that which balances it, is nationalism, tribalism, or group or national identity. The nation one belongs to is, for most people, one of the first and most fundamental ways they are defined, even if they don't acknowledge it. But what drives this identity? Is it a natural allegiance to those geographically or culturally closest? Or has it developed through the arguments of elites as a political motivator? What utility does national identity have? One of the first groups of theories of national identity is primordialism. Primordialism is a term first used by Edward Shiels, who in an influential article written in 1975 argued that national identities were natural, ineffable, and attributed to the tie of blood. For theorists of primordialism, national identity is explained through contiguity, custom, blood relations, language, but is something that one is born into, naturally, a priori. That is, it is not a changeable social construction, but an inevitable mode of being. It precedes us. These ties of kinship are strongly tied to a deep emotion that is uncontrollable, rather than rational. Clifford Geertz, another primordial theorist, writes that they have overpowering coerciveness in and of themselves. Primordialism has come under a lot of criticism. In an oft-quoted article, The Poverty of Primordialism, Jack Elner and Reed Colan argue that recent evidence disputes the idea that there is anything natural about these ties, and that there is stronger evidence that they are socially constructed. The authors argue that the language of primordialism implies that national identity is a spiritual, mystical, unchangeable phenomenon that has been here since the beginning, whatever beginning really means. National identity for primordialists is something that affects you, that you don't have any control over. Modernist theories of national identity generally critique primordialism. Modernists argue that national identity is a concept that developed roughly over the last 2 centuries, simultaneously to modern phenomena like capitalism, democracy, urbanization, and industrialization. In other words, national identity is not a natural or biological inclination. It's a construction that has a modern cause. The most prominent modernists include Ernest Gellner and Benedict Anderson. Gellner is by far the most influential theorist of nationalism. For Gellner, modern nationalism is a distinct and clear result of Western industrialization in the 19th century. The difference between the modern world and the pre-modern one is that physical work in any pure form has all but disappeared. What is still called manual labour does not involve swinging a pickaxe or heaving soil with a spade. It generally involves controlling, managing, and maintaining a machine with a fairly sophisticated control mechanism. Technical industrial production requires a certain proficiency, and so a meritocracy developed that essentially meant that machines and tools were best utilised by those with the talents to make use of them. But the difference between these jobs isn't that large. Understanding the world requires a basic framework that is transferable, a framework largely based around the scientific method that was beginning to be understood during the Enlightenment and at the beginning of the modern era. A machine to make a table isn't that different from a machine to make a car. What's important is reading instructions, knowing basic mathematics, speaking the language. Instead of being born then into a family role, a family of butchers or carpenters, a citizen would now be better off learning the basic education required to transfer their talents between simplistic jobs. Gellner writes that a modern society is, in this respect, like a modern army, only more so. It provides a very prolonged and fairly thorough training for all its recruits, insisting on certain shared qualifications: literacy, numeracy, basic work habits and social skills. The assumption is that anyone who has completed the generic training common to the entire population can be retrained for most other jobs without too much difficulty. In other words, a shared national culture is necessary for citizens to be mobile within that culture. Education, especially universal literacy, is key, and national identity is essential to modern industrial societies. If I'm from London and I move to Manchester, I can be sure that things will work in roughly the same way. Gellner's theory is laid out in Nations and Nationalism, published in 1983, and in the same year another influential book on nationalism, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, was published. For Anderson, national identity is imagined, but that doesn't make it any less real. Anderson reminds us that the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Anderson attributes national identity to a number of key phenomena. First, the idea of a continuous, stable national identity was perfect to replace a religious worldview that had been dominant in Europe through the medieval period. Helped by the printing press, Anderson argues that the newspaper began to present the nation as a continuous story, with characters entering and exiting the stage at different times. On top of this, you assume that imagined others in the community have read the same story, and you have a shared cultural code. Next, he argues that capitalism encouraged printers to print first in Latin, but then in local vernaculars to find new markets and to keep expanding. Anderson's study looks to Indochina and Latin America, asking why in the former, nationalism in Vietnam, Cambodia and China were at odds with each other when they were all communist countries, and in the latter, asking why nationalisms developed on a continent with roughly a shared language. Anderson argues that the combination of capitalism and print media created these imagined geographical networks. In South America, for example, trade routes or the travels of administrators took on a certain bureaucratic shape, where people on the same routes would meet, read the same newspapers, know the same political stories, creating an imagined community. Bolivia, for example, would develop a separate print story to Paraguay. Professor of Nationalism John Brewley, though, is sceptical of these sorts of grand theories that claim to explain every particular case. For Brewley, there are different types of nationalisms. A framework to analyse nationalism can produce different results. This is primarily about power, and so arguments about class, culture, language or myth that are created to justify or galvanise people come secondary to the principle of political leaders and peoples coming together out of a need for strength. Brewley's Nationalism and the State is a comprehensive historical analysis of different nationalisms and their relationship to the idea of what the state is. And finally, the historian Eric Hobsbawm's Marxist reading of nationalism as the invention of tradition argues that national myths are perpetuated by elites through repetition and continuity of the past, which justifies itself through an ability to conserve, a kind of it's worked before, so we should keep doing it mentality. So nationalism helps to legitimise the status quo. The British Houses of Parliament building, for example, was built in a Gothic style, even though it was built in the 19th century, to imply it was a long-standing, strong and trusted institution. These sorts of authoritative myths are embodied in statues, education, public holidays, all to give the impression of long-standing continuity. Of course, those with power are usually the ones to decide on what passes as long-standing or successful, and so what might count as that for elites might not do for the disenfranchised. For a Marxist like Hobsbawm then, nationalism is inherently linked to class. So nationalism and national identity are of course powerful phenomena, sometimes encouragingly so and sometimes dangerously so. Understanding how and why they function may help us to learn to either pacify some of its most dangerous effects or expand upon some of its most useful. If you want to support Then and Now, then please subscribe below, and most importantly, click the bell here to receive notifications when I upload a new video. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram in the links in the description below, and if you're feeling really generous, then this channel only exists through the support of pledges on Patreon, where you can support new content with as little as $1 for each new video. Thanks for watching. See you next week.